welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Allison Pataki is the New York Times bestselling author of The Trader's Wife, The Accidental Empress, Sissy, The Queen's Fortune, The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post, and most recently, Finding Margaret Fuller. She's also the author of the nonfiction memoir Beauty in the Broken Places and 2 children's books, Nellie Takes New York and Poppy Takes Paris. A former news writer and producer, Allison has written for the New York Times, USA Today, and other outlets. She's appeared on The Today Show, Good Morning America, and Morning Joe, and has several screenplay adaptations of her novels currently in development for film and television. Allison graduated from Yale University and lives in New York with her husband and family. Allison Pataki, thank you so much for joining today to talk about your radiant new novel, Finding Margaret Fuller. In a starred review. Oh, I'm so pleased to have you. In a starred review, Booklist says, Finding Margaret Fuller is a sweepingly urgent, inspiring novel about the astonishing life of Margaret Fuller, an invigorating fictional portrait of a brilliant woman. In another starred review, Publishers Weekly says Pataki's star-studded and gripping account is full of lush details about the life of an overlooked contributor to transcendentalism and women's rights. This is one to savor. Entertainment Weekly says Margaret Fuller led a life so vibrantly full that if she were a man, she'd be central in every history textbook. Luckily for us, Pataki is here to breathe life into Fuller's story via this sweeping new novel. And we'll do one more. New York Times bestselling author Kristen Harmel says, all of us who later benefited from the march toward equal rights for women should read this book, which honors an early feminist icon who broke nearly every rule and in doing so inspired a generation. So, with that, what can you tell us about this new book, your 10th, Finding Margaret Fuller?
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's nice when people who read your book get what you were going for on your best day, like what you were most hoping you could achieve, and then they somehow read your book and see all of that in the pages. It's edifying and affirming, because taking on a woman like Margaret Fuller, honestly, was a very humbling and daunting experience, because she was a woman who Edgar Allan Poe said, humanity is divided into men, women, and Margaret Fuller. She was on a plane unto her own. She was considered the most well-read person in America, the first woman to study at Harvard, the first female foreign news correspondent, the founding mother of Americans' women's rights movement and the fight for women's suffrage. So my book, Finding Margaret Fuller, as you said, my 10th, is a historical novel inspired by the incredible, inspiring, and far too little known life of what I will say should be America's leading lady, Margaret Fuller. First of, and then fill in the blank. She just did so much. As you heard in the quote, had she been a man, we'd all know her name. And we know the names of all of her contemporaries and all the supporting characters in this novel. And yet I really wanted to make her the leading lady, the central figure in her life story, which really just the raw material of the history reads like this epic, sweeping saga. I couldn't have made it up had I wanted to.
Yeah. How did you come across her? What inspired you to make Margaret Fuller your latest subject?
Yes. So I was reading a nonfiction book about the genius cluster of Concord, Massachusetts. So these are the great writers and thinkers who we all grew up reading and studying in school, the American canon as we think of it. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Louisa May Alcott, Herman Melville. What people don't know, I would venture to say, although we know their names, we've read their books, what people don't know is that they were all living together. They were all falling in and out of friendship, falling in and out of love, inspiring one another, competing with one another as they were writing these great American classics. And there was another woman there, the woman who Ralph Waldo Emerson described as the radiant genius and fiery heart at the center of the whole circle, and that was Margaret Fuller. So when I read this nonfiction account of this genius cluster, and I read about the character of Margaret Fuller, and I thought, I know about all these other guys.
Mhm.
She's the most interesting of them all. She jumped off the page. She took my imagination away, and I thought, that's the woman I want to write about. That's the name I want to know. And as has happened with all of my books, I had this moment of just thinking, how do I not know her name? I should know her name. I want to know more. And then I know I've met my next book, my next subject.
Why don't we?
I
Why do
know.
you think we didn't know her name? All the names of all of her friends, as
Yeah.
you've said, in this
Yeah.
whole cluster, like all of these huge names. And as you said, it sounds like she was the most fiery, perhaps the
Yeah.
most brilliant in this whole crew. And she's the name we don't know.
Yeah. Well, definitely the most fiery, definitely the most brazen, bold, and scandalous. She was Nathaniel Hawthorne's inspiration when he wrote the character of Hester Prynne. I know we've all read The Scarlet Letter. I will venture to say that a huge piece of it is that she was a woman. She just did not have the same opportunities for name recognition and acclaim as the men around her did, even though
Mm.
she was Emerson's first editor of the Dial magazine. She was the editor, the boss, the
Wow.
fearless leader of this transcendentalist group of thinkers. But she was a woman living a century ahead of her time, probably even more.
Mhm.
And then the other huge piece of that is her tragic death, which I don't want to put in spoilers. The readers will have to pick up the book, but I will just say Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was Margaret Fuller's mentee. Elizabeth Cady Stanton studied under Margaret Fuller. We know their names. They have said that Margaret Fuller was their founding mother. She gave them the founding document of the women's rights movement, the women's, march for suffrage. When Margaret Fuller wrote Woman in the 19th Century, it became the founding rallying cry for the women's rights movement in America. So those women went to live on many decades longer than Margaret did.
Mm.
And if you read Finding Margaret Fuller, you'll see why. You'll see what happens. Her voice was just silenced far too soon. And that's the unthinkable tragedy, the piece here. That's hard to accept.
Yeah. 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 I want to go back to something that you mentioned a second ago, which is that she was the inspiration for Hester Prynne.
Yeah.
Can you just tell that story a little bit?
Yes, yes. So we know Hester Prynne as the bold, brazen woman who bucks the confines of that suffocating Puritan world order. She brazenly wears the A as an adulteress because she's unwilling to disavow her status as a single, as a fallen woman,
Mhm.
as a mother who bore a child with not her husband. She refuses to reveal the identity of her lover. So when Nathaniel Hawthorne completed his first draft of this book about Hester Prynne and about sex and about scandal and society and sort of judgment, Mrs. Hawthorne read it and she took to bed for the rest of the day with a headache because she knew that the heroine, the brunette, free-spirited, willful, independent woman who's at the center of the whole book, Scarlet Letter, was not based on her. She knew it was based on the
Mhm.
beautiful, free-spirited, willful brunette who had been living just up the road and had sat out beside the river with her husband on all those summer evenings and had argued and debated with the men about free will, about women's rights, about matrimony, about sex. And so Margaret was the scandalous, subversive, dangerous woman in all of this. This isn't too big of a spoiler, but Margaret took a lover out of marriage. Margaret embraced her passionate, willful, free-spirited nature. A lot of this is happening in Italy, so readers will get to the pieces of Italy, the dashing Italian count. Margaret sparked an international scandal. She bore his child. The life, parallels between Margaret and Hester Prynne are right there, only it was happening not in Puritan New England, but pieces of it were happening in Rome during a time of the Roman Revolution. So really, like, it's all the raw materials, just so dramatic and juicy, and history is the furthest thing from boring. So I hope readers will enjoy getting to know the inspiration behind Hester Prynne's bold, brave behavior.
Oh, yeah. And she became the first woman to study at Harvard.
Yes, yes. So Margaret Fuller grew up and her father, quote unquote, educated her like a boy. So Margaret was fluent in Latin and Greek at the age of 5. She was just a brilliant, precocious mind her whole childhood. She left boarding school after a year because she was already smarter and more well-educated than all the teachers. It was a waste of her time. But so she was obviously not allowed entry to Harvard, even though it was just up the road from her. She grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but as a woman, she was denied entry. So what she would do is she would post up outside the Harvard campus and she would just invite the young men to debate with her, and she would debate philosophy and the classics and politics. And so eventually, later in life, when Margaret was working on a huge book of hers, Summer on the Lakes, she petitioned the president of Harvard to be granted permission to study at Harvard. She needed some of the sources and atlases and maps. And so Margaret Fuller was the first woman granted the right to study at Harvard. And she worked at Harvard while she was writing that book, Summer on the Lakes. So again, I've even talked to my friends who are alums of Harvard, and they don't even know the name Margaret Fuller. So that's interesting.
Really?
Mhm.
Even Harvard, and she was the first woman to study there, and it's not in the Harvard
It must be
lore.
buried. As is the case with so many of these women, they become footnotes and they become buried in the
Yeah.
shadows. And so what we're doing with historical fiction and with her story in general is pulling these women out of the footnotes, pulling them from the shadows and putting them center stage as the leading lady material that they are.
Yeah. You're known for your meticulous research and
Oh,
for the way you really make these characters and their lives jump off the page.
mhm.
Um, for this novel, what was that research process like?
Oh, yes. I love the research so much. And I love that it's different every time because that makes it so exciting. You and I both come from news backgrounds. And one of the things I love the investigative aspect of the research and of writing historical fiction. But one of the things that was a constant source of frustration for me in news was how quickly we had to move. And I just wanted to dwell and go deep and peel back the layers. And so as a writer of historical fiction, that's what I get to do, and I love it so much. So for Finding Margaret Fuller, the research had to start in Concord. It had to start where Margaret's story begins when she plugs in to this community of transcendentalists, this genius cluster, where Ralph Waldo Emerson invites her to come and stay in his home as a house guest, to write, to think, to argue, to debate. And he's attracting all these great thinkers to Concord at the time. He's got his handyman living up the stairs named Henry David Thoreau, who's putting up, rent free. He's paying the rent for the neighbors, the Alcotts, Louisa May Alcott's family, who because her father Bronson Alcott never can seem to afford the rent. And then Emerson's putting up the neighbors in the other direction, Louisa, and then he's putting up his neighbors in the other direction, the newlyweds Hawthorne. So Nathaniel
Mhm.
Hawthorne moves there with his new bride. And so they've got this moment in time in this place where America's really only a few decades old, and they're coming with their own canon, and they're this new republic built on individualism and self-reliance. They want to answer European letters and European art and literature with their own material. And so that's what's happening in Concord. And so I went there and I visited the Emerson home. I visited the Hawthorne home, the Alcott home. I sat on the boulders where Margaret would sit while she would be editing her work under the Massachusetts spring sunshine. And I have to start by soaking up as many of her details and the rich context and
Mm.
sitting in her bedroom looking out at Emerson's fruit trees, where she would have seen Thoreau clipping the fruit trees, and she would, write about the moments that they would have walking along the shores of Walden Pond, or sitting down to these incredibly tense, fractious family dinners with the Emersons and the Thoreaus. So I needed to be there, soak it up. And then really it's just about taking in as much of the raw material as I can. And I front load my research, and then I'll do on the spot research as individual questions come up throughout the process. But really, I do a huge bulk of research up front. And then at a certain point, the historical figure that I'm reading about on the page begins to come to life and begins to sort of take me by the hand and lead me into
Mhm.
scenes, into dialogue. And that's when I know I'm ready to make the transition from researching to writing the first draft.
About how long are you normally immersing yourself in historical documents and letters
Yeah.
before you start to hear the characters
Yeah.
speaking
Yeah.
to you?
Um, a few months. I'm taking in almost like all the ingredients, like I'm throwing everything in the pot, and then it just begins
Mhm.
to like marinate and simmer.
Yeah.
So like what works well for me is I'll do a ton of reading or researching or visiting, and then I'll just like take a really long walk or something, and it will just all begin to marinate, and I'll begin to sort of like, there's this great quote, it's an EL doctoral quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, "The biographer will tell you what happened, the novelist will tell you how it felt."
Mm-hmm.
That is what I'm getting at. Once I know what happened,
Hmm.
to the extent that we can know what happened,
Yeah.
as it was largely the men wrote it. I know the dates, I know where we are, I know the facts of who was there and what happened. And then what I want to do for the reader is imagine how it would have felt to inhabit those scenes. We know that this awful family meal happened where Mrs. Emerson asked Margaret if she would walk with her after the meal. And Margaret said, "I'm very sorry, but your husband already asked me if I would walk with him after the meal." Mrs. Emerson gets up from the table in tears, and Thoreau helps her to bed.
Oh
And
gosh.
Emerson doesn't follow her, and Margaret gets mad at Mr. Emerson for not following Mrs. Emerson. And we know that there are these moments because we read it in their own words. So then we, as readers or writers of historical fiction, get to enter into those moments, get to participate in the history. And so that's, one of the things I love so much about historical fiction.
How closely do you stick to historical fact in your writing? You stick pretty close, right?
Because I'd be crazy not to.
Yeah.
That's what we say. The raw material is just that good. Why would I make this up? So, you have Emerson, you have Thoreau, you have Hawthorne, you have Poe, you have Walt Whitman, you have William Wordsworth, you have Frederic Chopin, you have all of these great people. Like somebody said, if you were writing this purely as fiction and you put all these people together at the same time, having all of this interpersonal drama, we would have said this is crazy.
Yeah.
But it actually happened. So why wouldn't I stick to the actual raw material? Because it's just that good. I didn't need to change it. I'm writing biographical historical fiction, and what I will say is I'm never claiming to write the biography. That's already been done. I'm so thankful to the
Mhm.
historians and biographers who did that. Those are the shoulders on which I'm able to stand. So I don't want, I'm not claiming to be like the official biographer, but what I want is the curators and the historians and the biographers who read it to say it passes muster. I want it
Mhm.
to pass a certain level of credibility while delivering an immersive, transportive, fictional narrative, a story, a tale that can hopefully be both entertaining and educational. Hopefully we can learn a thing or two, and that makes it fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. I love historical fiction, good historical fiction for that exact reason. I feel like when I'm reading it, I'm I'm learning something and I'm also wildly entertained.
Yeah, hopefully. And
Yeah.
then we have the author's note to explain if we had to diverge with a date or something that wasn't serving the story. And so we took that prerogative of artistic license. Like for instance, I don't know that Thoreau was living in the Emerson's upstairs alcove at exactly the day that Margaret arrived. I know he was living in Concord that summer. He might have been living up the road at his aunt's house still. But I know that that was the summer that he was at the Emerson home and made leather shoes for Mrs. Emerson's chickens because the feet were tearing up the gardens. And so if I can place him there in the
Mhm.
yard, and I can place Margaret Fuller there, living there and visiting there that spring and that summer, then I can have them meet. because I'm writing historical fiction. And then I can explain in the author's note that I took that license.
Yeah. How did you first get started writing historical fiction?
Yeah. Well, I was a writer in news, as you know, because we worked together. We were news colleagues back in the day on the news desk. And I would come home from my shifts in news. And as you know, it was breaking news. It was super high stress.
Mm.
I would come home and sort of as an antidote, as a release at the end of the news shift, I would whip out my computer and I would just start writing historical fiction, sort of like as my therapy. And after I had two completed manuscripts on my computer of historical fiction. I thought, I think I'm in the wrong line of work. I know I want to be writing. I know I want to be investigating. I know I love history. I love storytelling. But I think I found a different way to do that that's actually much more satisfying to me.
Ah.
And so I made the transition in 2012, from working full time in that, as a desk job, to then being like, okay, I'm gonna give it a try with this writing, this fiction thing. And I queried agents, and I got an agent, and I kept my day job, just to pay the bills. But then once my first book came out, I thought, okay, it's that adage: if you find what you love to do, you never work a day in your life.
Mhm.
And I get to play make believe. I get to just pretend and get lost in stories, and so that's what I love to do.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, getting that getting the agent and getting that first book
Yeah,
out,
yeah, yeah.
that what
So
publication?
yeah, so you can remember we were working in news in like 2008. It
Mm.
was the Great Recession. So many of the news networks had writing freezes and were chopping staff. We were all, desperately scared to not have jobs as news writers. And in publishing, they were similarly skittish. I can't tell you how many agents I was told, well, I had never published. I was an unknown entity. I was young. I had no idea what I was doing. It just wasn't the time for them to take a risk for me.
Mm.
I found my agent, who I'm still with, 12 years later, Lacey Lynch, who, like me, was brand new and totally green. She'd never published a fiction novel before. She took a chance on me. I took a chance on her. As I alluded to, I had these two completed manuscripts on my computer. I got the meeting. I got a few meetings and I got rejected. I had one meeting left at Simon and Schuster to speak about this other manuscript. And my agent had prepared me to say, what else are you working on? They want to know you're not going to be a one-hit wonder. If they take a chance on you, you've got a tail here. So I was working on the story of Peggy Shippen Arnold, Benedict Arnold's wife, the third character in this plot, this treasonous plot to turn over George Washington during the American Revolution. We know the names of Benedict Arnold and John Andre, the two men that conspired. I had no idea that Peggy Shippen Arnold, the wife, was the interesting, like, connecting piece in the whole thing. And it was just Shakespearean to me, the backstory between Peggy and these two men,
Mhm.
and how close they came to ending the American Revolution, and that it was a love triangle, and just that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton were totally duped by her. And I was just like, she was like Lady Macbeth to me in colonial clothing. And so I had this meeting. I was supposed to be selling this other book, and they were like, what else are you working on? I was like, well, let me tell you about Benedict Arnold's wife. And I was just started talking about this thing I was working on. And at the end of the meeting, my editor, who would become my editor on my first two books, Beth Adams, she said, actually, I want to buy that book. And my agent was like, if someone wants to buy your book, you sell them whatever book they want to buy. So I sold my first book,
Great.
The Trader's Wife, in 2012, published in 2014. And at the time I was told, the American Revolution really doesn't sell. David McCullough can sell it as dry nonfiction to men, writing about John Adams, but Martha Washington isn't sexy. I was like, Abigail Adams might not be sexy, but I'm telling you, Peggy Shippen Arnold is sexy. John Andre, this is sexy. So I sold The Trader's Wife, and I think a few years later with Hamilton, I think people can agree that the American Revolution has become sexy, but I was happy to be a part of that.
And now, as we mentioned, Finding Margaret Fuller is your 10th book. 10
Yeah,
books,
yeah,
about
10
10
books in 10
years.
years. Yeah, yeah. I'm
Each
tired.
one involving massive amounts of research because you are not sticking to one time period or one place in the world. You're all
Yes,
over the map.
literally.
Um,
I'm all over the map and all over the centuries. I'm just
and
doing
you
my
have
best to give my agent whiplash.
and you have kids. How
Yes.
how how do you do it? How do you keep from absolutely burning out?
Yeah. Yeah. I have 3 daughters. When I started out, I had 0 daughters.
Mhm,
Now I have 3. And like right now we're talking and my girls are at school. And that
mhm,
is my window of time to work. And I'm a morning person, so I wake up if I'm on like a really serious deadline, I'll wake up at like 5 to try to steal those first few hours before everyone else is up and bustling in the
mhm.
house. And I get them out to school. And just like any working mom, I have to take my moments. I have to take my time. I have to lean on support, from my partner. And we've got an amazing babysitter, play dates. We
Yeah.
have to cobble together the time. And not just me, but I will say every author, burnout is real. I've done enough work. Same with when we were in news, burnout was so real.
Mm,
Um, I'm also a certified yoga instructor. I would say I've done a lot of work in the past decade over assembling the toolbox of things that I know I need to stay centered and grounded. And I know, like in a period of book launch, it's so intense.
yeah.
There are so many different ebbs and flows in this job. When you're in an intense period of writing or an intense period of drafting, the original first draft, or you're in an intense period of launching and promoting, it's all different. And you definitely do hit those moments where you're just exhausted. And then
Mhm.
you just have to come back to like, you just have to take a break and take like you need a night of good sleep, and you need some good herbal tea, and you need to go to a yoga class or take a hike. And I know the things that I sort of need to get myself back to stasis. Because I want to continue to love what I do. I don't want it and that's a luxury, obviously, to love what you do. And I'm profoundly appreciative and grateful and aware of that. So it has ebbs and flows. And I would say that the different hats we wear also help to keep it's cyclical. So whatever you're in,
Mhm.
that cycle will eventually shift to a new one.
Yeah.
So you just kind of appreciate the pluses and minuses of each kind of phase. I know at this point, 10 years in, I kind of have a rhythm. Like I'm writing, I'm researching, then I'm writing, then I'm editing, then I'm launching. It's kind of like
Mhm.
the year has its cadence.
How long are you typically working on each book from when you
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
start that research to handing in your final
Yeah.
draft?
So Marjorie Post was my longest. It was 6 years. It took me 6 years to finish that book because there was just so much. Her life was so recent and it's
Mhm.
so well documented. Margaret Fuller was 3 years. I would say the average is somewhere between like 2 to 3 years.
So you're working on multiple
Yeah, I'm working on my book
projects.
now. I'm working on my book now that's going to come out in 26.
Wow.
And then I've already got the wheels turning, beginning the research for the one that would come after that.
Wow, that's great.
And I want to do more children's books. I really want to do more children's books. I just love the children's space so much. I love the readings with children. It's just more fun.
Mhm.
No offense to any of the adults. It's like ice cream. It's like ice cream versus like
Mhm.
a filet mignon. Let's go with that.
Both have their place.
Both are great. And you want both, right?
Yeah,
And they
I don't want a life without ice cream.
or filet mignon. So
Right.
they work nicely together. So that's why I want to keep doing my women, my her story, my historical fiction about strong leading ladies. But I
Mhm.
also love the children's because it's a sweet
Yeah.
companion.
What is your writing routine
Yeah.
like?
Yeah.
Your
So I'll get
daily.
down, I'll get myself like a really good cup of coffee.
Mhm.
um and my water, so I'm hydrated. And
Yeah.
then I'll sit down at my computer. I like to work from home. I'm not a coffee shop worker. I'm not a library worker. I need to be able to like control the music. Like I'll have a playlist that's vibing with whatever I'm working on that's kind of tonally inspiring me. And then I need to be able to control like the refills of like water and like, running to the restroom. And like I like to be in like my space. And then if I can get into like a great state of flow where I have that uninterrupted chunk of time, I'll just write for as many hours as I have before. Usually I need to either walk the dog or go pick up a kid from school.
Are you a plotter or a pantser? I
I'm a
know.
plotter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah. Because I'm working from history.
Well,
So that, yeah, so this is the question for writers. Like, are you just
yeah.
flying by the seat of your pants? Or are you like working off a very serious plot outline?
Mhm.
The history is my bones. So the history is my outline. That's my structure. I know my beginning, middle, and end. I know who's there. I know the characters. I know the dates. I know where I'm putting them, when I'm putting them there. Um, so the history is my plot. And then once I've taken in enough of the raw material of the history, then I get to a more intuitive place in the process. I let the story lead me. That first draft is really the story revealing itself to me.
Mhm.
In that part of the process, I am flying by the seat of my pants. I'm just taking
Mhm.
it step by step, but with a really strong historical outline as my backbone.
That makes sense because obviously, yes, the facts are there, but you're still shaping this narrative that you're putting together in your book, and you're figuring out what goes where and when you're going to reveal certain things and when the narrative tension comes. And
Yes,
so,
exactly. So if the history is the bones, I think of myself as going in and putting on the flesh
yeah,
and building the story. And really, so why I say that first draft is the story revealing itself to me. The subsequent drafts are then about me trying to shape the story to make sure I'm giving to the reader the experience that I'm hoping to create.
yeah, yeah, that's great. That
And
totally.
I work on lots of edits. That's the other thing. Writers are like, do you struggle over every sentence?
Mhm.
And really, like that first draft is so meticulous. Or I'm an editor. I will just get it out. I will like vomit out my ideas and my thoughts, and then I will come back and I will fine tune and craft for many, many drafts.
You enjoy it?
I do. I really enjoy that because I feel like that's where you're really doing like the shape work. Like that's where you're like
Mhm.
almost like a sculptor. So I do enjoy that. I enjoy that piece.
Do you consider yourself a historian first or a writer first?
A writer first. I consider myself a history dork,
Mhm.
somebody who just loves history and wants to ingest and take in as much of it as I can. And I'm incredibly motivated and moved and inspired by history. But I'm a writer first because I just like make it up. Like I'm a storyteller. Because really the first love for me is the story. It's the narrative.
Mhm.
It's what drew me to news in the first place. I want to get at people's stories.
Mhm.
But then history to me provides the most salacious, interesting backdrop for the story. And I think history gives us the best stories. But really what I want to get at is that story. And I'll read stories. I read books set anywhere, anytime. Um, I love historical fiction, obviously, as my main first true love, but
Mhm.
really I love stories from anywhere. I love The Maid, which is, modern day, but I love historical fiction as well. So um yeah, so I would say story first, story driven.
What is your reading life like? Because it would have to be
Yeah.
deeply involved in history and historical fiction, but I'm sure, as you said, also because you're a lover of stories and a writer of fiction, I'm sure a lot of contemporary fiction and everything as well. So,
Yeah, there are kind of four prongs to my reading. The first is I'm always reading for research, and that's very specifically towards like whatever woman I'm obsessed with at the moment and researching for potentially my next book. The second piece of it is I'm always reading for like the industry. So for
mhm,
blurbs, cover quotes, I've got a pile of ARCs sitting right here that I'm reading for possible cover quotes, or huge big books that are like peer authors that I want to read, or I'm like doing a panel with them. I want to be up to speed on what's happening in our industry. Then the other piece of that is like what I'm just reading for pleasure. And that runs the gamut, everything from nonfiction, biography, self-help, contemporary fiction, rom-com, historical fiction that I'm seeking out on my own. And then there's the children's books piece, which I'm always reading that for research, but also just because I have three little ones. Our
yeah.
life is just brimming with children's books at the moment.
How do you know when you found your next subject?
I will tell my husband, I will say, I've been bitten. I just know the story just like gets its hooks in me and I can't stop thinking about her. And I get happy when I think about like, oh, I get to read about her. I get to learn about her. I just get this like gut feeling where I'm like, I need to know more about this woman. I want to tell this woman's story. I want to give years of my life to researching this woman. And then hopefully, if readers will have me, many more years of my life talking about this woman.
Yeah. How what do you know now that you wish you had known before you published your first book?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. And oh, how incredibly supportive this writing community is, specifically of women authors. I
Mm,
came in as a babe in the woods. I didn't know anyone really in publishing. I didn't know any other authors. I would just kind of like stalk authors that I loved and send them notes like through their emails. And at that time, like there wasn't even really that much social media or podcasts or anything that I like had, that I had a deep fluency with. So I just like how much support there is available. Like people like you, people who are book influencers, people on Instagram who will like bake a cake to look like your book cover and then tag it on Instagram, just
yeah.
um has supportive and nurturing of a community. It is I was like really scared with my first few books. I had no idea what I was doing, but just that there is this community of support. And what I've been conscious of as a reader is I received that from authors who were further along in the journey. And now I want to.
Mm.
I always want to be supportive of other women's work as well and other women's books and everything that we're doing in this book world. So that's a piece of it. And then the second piece is that um it's okay to not have it feel like it's perfect. Like my literary agent said, it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to get to the place where you're like, okay, I'm done. This is the perfect book. But you can keep editing. You can keep doing those drafts. Hold, have faith in your work and don't put this pressure on yourself that it needs to be perfect the first time you write it or the 10th time you write it. Just there's conviction and power in the act of just doing. So do it and keep doing it and keep at it.
That's great advice. And I was actually just about to say, what advice do you have for aspiring authors? Which I think that would be a great piece of it. Is there any other advice you would specifically give to?
Yeah, well, just to dovetail off that, I think if you're an aspiring author, it means you have a story that you feel you need to tell. It's like a compulsion. You have this something in you and you want to get it out. And so you have to do it. That's a sacred urge you feel, the creative urge, whatever it is, whether you're an artist or a chef or an author or whatever your creative expression. And there could be many, many, pieces to that. Do it, create, sit down, have boldness, have confidence, play and explore that.
Play. I love that. That's great. Play. All right. Traditional last question. When Finding Margaret Fuller is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
I love it. Okay, well, there were so many just beautiful, tender, like moments in nature.
Mm.
They were transcendentalists. They wanted to find experiences that were rapturous and took their souls outside of their bodies. So I think something like evocative and melodic. And I'm thinking like I loved the score of Downton Abbey.
Oh,
Something like
yeah.
that's tender and
Yeah.
beautiful, moving and poignant, instrumental. So I could think something like that. And you didn't ask this, but I'm going to add that I would love to see Natalie Portman play Margaret
I
Fuller.
would love that. That would be great.
And we have like Downton Abbey music and Natalie Portman. Let's just do that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. I'm ready. I'm ready for the movie now. Let's watch it.
Or it can be a series. It could be
Or
a
a
series.
series, actually. Yes. I will.
Yes wants to make
That'd
it.
be
That's
great.
great.
Let's just, yes, put that out there. Whoever,
Putting
yeah.
it
The next Downton Abbey.
Yes, exactly. America.
Allison Pataki, thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me. Happy reading.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.